Of course, here is a completely new separate story with all new characters and events, written as one continuous text without headings or divisions. They had waited until the middle of the lesson because they thought it would hurt more that way. Not enough to create a scene in front of neighbors, not enough to look openly cruel if anyone asked later, but exactly enough to remind the man at their dining room table that in their house, his dignity could be interrupted on command. I think this arrangement has gone as far as it can, Caroline Whitmore said, standing in the doorway with her arms folded and her smile arranged so carefully it barely qualified as one. Her husband stood half a step behind her, white, tall, expensive, silent in the way certain men become when they want power to feel like atmosphere instead of speech. At the table, Elijah Brooks set down his pen beside a half-finished algebra problem and looked up slowly. Across from him, 12-year-old Henry Whitmore went very still, because Henry, unlike his parents, understood exactly what was happening. They were not ending a tutoring contract. They were humiliating the only adult who had ever made him feel less stupid in his own house. Less than a minute later, when Henry started crying and said the one thing neither of his parents expected him to say out loud, the whole room changed. But until then, Caroline and David Whitmore were very pleased with themselves. They thought they were dismissing a black tutor. They did not yet know they were about to hear the truth from their own son. The Whitmores lived in a gated neighborhood outside Philadelphia, where the lawns were professionally cut, the mailboxes all matched, and the people inside the houses liked to believe money had refined them. Their home was the kind of place real estate agents described as timeless because it had columns, pale stone, and a kitchen larger than most apartments. Caroline Whitmore ran charity committees and spoke often about standards. David Whitmore was a partner at a private wealth firm and had mastered the kind of social calm that made arrogance sound like reasonable concern. Together, they had raised Henry in a house full of opportunity and pressure, which can sometimes look identical from the outside. Henry was a bright child in the way many anxious children are bright, observant, sensitive, and already too skilled at reading adult disappointment. He attended St. Bartholomew Academy, a private school full of blazers, polished shoes, and children who understood grades not as feedback, but as ranking. By sixth grade, Henry had become quietly terrified of math, not because he was incapable of it, but because every mistake seemed to confirm something his parents had started saying without realizing how deep it cut. He was unfocused. He was underperforming. He wasn't applying himself. In a different house, those might have been temporary concerns. In this one, they hardened into identity. For nearly a year, his parents had cycled through tutors the way wealthy people often cycle through service providers they secretly expect to perform miracles. A retired teacher who was too soft, a graduate student who was too casual, a stern man from a prep company who made Henry cry twice and still got rehired for another month because David thought fear might finally sharpen him. Nothing worked. Henry's grades stayed uneven. Worse, he began freezing in the middle of tests, staring at simple equations as if numbers themselves had become hostile. Elijah Brooks entered the picture almost by accident. He was 32, black, slender, neatly dressed, and far less interested in impressing parents than in understanding children. He had taught middle school math for 5 years in Baltimore before leaving classroom work to care for his father during a long illness. After his father passed, Elijah began tutoring privately while finishing a graduate certificate in educational psychology. He had a gift that some people mistook for gentleness until they watched it work. He could look at a child's confusion and find the actual wound beneath the wrong answer. He understood that many students who were called lazy were really afraid, and many who were called difficult had simply stopped offering trust to adults who treated them like broken appliances. He was hired after Henry's science teacher, one of the few adults in St. Bartholomew who still seemed to see children as people, quietly told Caroline that her son did not need a harder tutor. He needed a smarter one. Caroline had not liked that phrasing. She liked Elijah even less the moment he walked in for the interview, and did not perform gratitude for being invited into her home. He was perfectly polite. That was not the issue. The issue was that he was composed in a way she found difficult to place. He did not shrink. He did not over-explain his resume. He asked to see Henry's old assignments before discussing strategy, and when David tried to steer the conversation toward discipline and measurable accountability, Elijah nodded once and said, "That matters." But if a child is panicking, more pressure just teaches him to panic faster. Caroline had smiled tightly and later told David in private, "He seems very sure of himself." David had answered, "As long as he gets results." And results came. Not dramatic, cinematic, instant results. Better. Real ones. Within 3 weeks, Henry stopped pretending he had forgotten homework when he actually didn't understand it. Within 5 weeks, he was raising his hand in math twice a week. Within 2 months, his quiz scores moved from barely passing to steady Bs. But the deeper change happened in the room, not the gradebook. Elijah made Henry explain how he was thinking, not just what answer he landed on. He praised precision, not speed. He told him mistakes were information, not character. When Henry spiraled, Elijah did not say calm down, the least useful phrase in the English language for an anxious child. He broke problems smaller. He waited. He did not flinch when Henry got frustrated. Little by little, the boy who had started each session apologizing for being bad at math began starting them with actual questions. Henry adored him. That was part of the problem. Not for Henry, for his parents. At first, Caroline enjoyed telling friends she had found someone surprisingly effective. Then she began noticing other things. Henry laughing during lessons. Henry defending Elijah when David called an approach too slow. Henry once saying at dinner, "Mr. Brooks says understanding why matters more than memorizing the shortcut." That sentence had landed badly, not because it was offensive, because it introduced another adult's authority into a household that preferred authority to remain white, parental, and unquestioned. The fracture widened over small moments. Elijah suggested Henry might need reduced performance pressure around test weeks. Caroline called that coddling. Elijah recommended they stop discussing grades at the dinner table in front of guests. David asked whether he was tutoring their son or managing their home. Elijah answered, "Both affect the child." That one sat in the room like a lit match. Then came the parent dashboard email. Henry had earned an 89 on a pre-algebra assessment, the highest math grade he had received all year. He was proud enough to print it. Elijah was proud enough to say, "This is what happens when you trust your own thinking." But the Whitmores somehow turned even that into suspicion. At a cocktail gathering the next weekend, Caroline mentioned the grade to another parent, who asked who was tutoring Henry now. When she said Elijah Brooks, the woman paused and said, "Oh, isn't he the one who used to work at the Community Center Scholarship Program?" The tone wrapped that word around class and race so delicately that only people fluent in that kind of coded speech ever seemed to hear the whole insult. Caroline heard it. She looked him up later that night and found a photo of Elijah teaching a free math workshop at a city youth nonprofit. The kids in the picture were mostly black, mostly poor, mostly smiling at him with the kind of trust children reserve for adults who actually see them. Something sour moved in her. She told herself it was concern about rigor. She told David the background felt a little less elite than she had assumed. David, who would never say anything as naked as what he thought, simply started watching Elijah more closely during lessons. He noticed the open-ended questions, the patience, the lack of severity. He also noticed Henry improving anyway, which should have settled the matter. Instead, it unsettled him more. Some parents do not only want success for their children, they want their own philosophy vindicated in the process. Elijah was helping Henry without validating the Whitmore's worldview, and that made him increasingly intolerable. The breaking point arrived over a workbook. Elijah had assigned Henry 5 medium difficulty problems and told him to stop after the second one if he felt himself rushing. Henry did all 5, got 4 correct, and was visibly proud. David came in, reviewed the page, and said, "Only 5?" Elijah explained that quality mattered more than volume for a child rebuilding confidence. David replied, "Or maybe confidence comes from learning how to handle more than 5 questions." Henry shut down almost instantly. Elijah saw it happen and said very calmly, "Mr. Whitmore, if you'd like to talk approach, I'm happy to do that after the session." Not in front of him. David had gone cold. Caroline, hearing about it afterward, called it inappropriate. Elijah called it educationally necessary. The contract lasted 1 more week, which is how, on a rainy Tuesday at 5:23 p.m., Elijah found himself at the Whitmore's dining table, working through fractions and variable isolation, while the 2 people paying him prepared to dismiss him like a servant who had exceeded his station. Henry was halfway through a problem involving negative values when Caroline appeared in the doorway. She wore cream slacks and a cashmere sweater, and the expression of a woman who believed herself composed because she had outsourced every visible form of disorder in her life. David stood beside her, one hand in his pocket. Elijah knew immediately, not from the words, from the staging. "We need a moment," Caroline said. Henry looked up. "Now?" "Yes," she said. "Now." Elijah set his pen down. "Would you prefer I step out?" "No," David said. "This concerns you." Henry's fingers tightened around his pencil. Caroline stepped farther into the room. "Mr. Brooks, I think this arrangement has gone as far as it can. We appreciate the time you spent, but we've decided Henry needs a different kind of academic support going forward." Elijah had been dismissed before in his life, quietly, abruptly, unfairly, even once vindictively. He recognized the shape of it, but there was something especially deliberate in doing it in front of the child mid-lesson, as though they wanted Henry to witness the hierarchy more than they wanted the contract ended cleanly. "I see," he said. David added, "We think a more traditional, more rigorous fit would serve him better." Henry's face changed in a way neither parent seemed to register because they were busy congratulating themselves for sounding measured. "But my test score—" "This isn't about one test," Caroline said. Elijah looked at Henry first, not them. "You don't need to worry about this right now." "Yes, he does," David said. "It's his education." Elijah turned slowly. "Then perhaps it should have been discussed privately." That annoyed Caroline exactly the way truth often annoys people who consider manners their private property. "Please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. I'm not the one doing this in front of him." The room tightened. David stepped forward half an inch, enough to remind everyone he was the father, the payer, the owner of the table, the walls, the moment. "Let's be clear. We brought you in to help with math, not to question how we handle our son." Elijah's voice remained level. "And I helped with math." "Yes," Caroline said, "but there are concerns." Elijah waited. She went on. And once she started, the real thing came out. It always does. "Your methods are unconventional," she said. "There's too much emphasis on feelings and not enough on standards. Henry needs someone who understands the level expected at a school like St. Bartholomew." Elijah looked at her for a beat. "His grades improved." David said, "That's not the only metric." "No," Elijah said quietly. "Clearly." Caroline ignored that. "We also think a tutor with a more academically competitive background would be a better influence at this stage." There it was. Not explicit enough to repeat at a country club without consequence. Explicit enough for everyone in the room to hear what it meant. A better influence. A school like St. Bartholomew. Academically competitive background. Elijah had heard versions of this language his whole adult life. It was how certain white parents translated their discomfort with a black educator who did not come stamped by the institutions they worshipped. He could have challenged every coded phrase. He could have listed his certifications, his training, his results, the evidence sitting open in Henry's folder. Instead, he asked the more honest question. "Is this about my qualifications," he said, "or your assumptions about them?" The silence that followed was immediate. Caroline's face hardened. "Excuse me?" "You heard me." David gave a short, incredulous laugh. "See, this is part of the issue. That chip on the shoulder." Elijah almost smiled, but there was no humor in it. "People usually say that when they don't like being recognized clearly." Henry made a tiny sound then, not yet crying, but close. Neither parent stopped. David was too far inside the righteousness of his own role. "We're ending this professionally," he said. "Don't turn it into something else." Elijah stood slowly enough not to alarm Henry. "You already did." He reached for his notebook, and that was when Henry broke. "No!" The word came out sharp, frightened, and so full of panic that all three adults turned to him at once. Henry shoved his chair back so fast it scraped the hardwood. His face was red, his eyes were wet. He looked at Elijah first, then at his parents, then back at Elijah like he was afraid the moment was already gone. "No," he said again, and now tears were spilling freely. "You can't fire him." Caroline stared. "Henry! No!" he shouted louder now, voice cracking. "You always do this. You always get rid of people when they don't say what you want. David's face changed completely. That is enough. But Henry had been quiet too long, and once children start telling the truth in front of the wrong audience, adults often discover they have less control than they imagined. You said he wasn't good enough before you even knew him, Henry cried. You said he didn't seem like our kind of person. I heard you. Caroline went white. David's jaw tightened. You are upset. You don't understand what you heard. I do understand. Henry was sobbing now, real sobbing, the kind that comes from terror mixed with relief at finally speaking. He turned to Elijah with desperate urgency. Please don't go. Please, you're the only one who doesn't make me feel dumb. The room shattered open around that sentence. Elijah stood perfectly still. Caroline whispered, Henry. But the boy was looking only at his tutor now, crying so hard his shoulders shook. You're the only one who waits when I get stuck. You're the only one who doesn't look at me like I already failed. I hate math when they talk about it. I don't hate it with you. David tried to step in, but Henry jerked back from him in a way that made even his father stop. You said I needed someone more serious, Henry cried, but he's the one who helped me. He's the reason I got the 89. You didn't even say good job. You just asked why it wasn't a 90. Silence, the kind that strips wallpaper off a room. Caroline's mouth opened and closed once. No sound came. And then Henry said the thing that finished it. You want to fire him because he makes me feel better, he said, choking on the words. And because you don't like that, I listened to him. Nobody moved. Children do not always know the language of prejudice, but they know its weather. They know which adults are welcomed before they speak, and which ones are examined like misplaced furniture. Henry had been living inside that pressure for months. He didn't have the sociology for it. He had the ache. That was enough. Elijah looked at the child and felt something complicated tear through him. Grief, protectiveness, anger, and the terrible humility of being trusted by a kid in a room where trust had become dangerous. He spoke softly. Henry, breathe. The boy tried. Caroline had tears in her eyes now too, but not all tears are equal. Some come from hurt. And then say mean stuff when people leave. And then say mean stuff when people leave. You said he wasn't polished enough, and Dad said he thought he was too comfortable here. David looked as if someone had struck him across the mouth. Elijah closed his notebook slowly and said, to neither parent in particular, I think I should go. Henry started crying harder. Please don't. David found his voice first, but it was weaker now, trying to recover control after it had already been publicly disproven. Henry, calm down. Elijah turned to him then with more force than he had used all evening. No, don't tell him to calm down after this. David froze. Elijah's face remained composed, but the calm in it had changed texture. He is not overreacting. He is telling you what this felt like from where he sits. Caroline sank into one of the dining chairs as though her knees had briefly become unreliable. She looked at her son, really looked, and for the first time all evening seemed to understand that what she had arranged as a tidy correction had become a revelation about her own house. Wrong. I don't want another tutor. Wrong. I don't want another tutor. Okay. I don't want one who thinks I'm broken. Elijah's throat tightened. Okay. David said quietly, no one thinks you're broken. Henry laughed through tears in the terrible way children do when they do not yet know how cruel accuracy sounds. Then why do you always act like I am? No one answered because every available answer was an indictment. For a long moment the rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows, and the big expensive house felt very small. Then Caroline stood again, but differently now, not staged, not in control. She looked at Elijah and spoke without polish for the first time since he had met her. Mr. Brooks, she said, I think we have handled this badly. Elijah did not rescue her with false modesty. Yes. She nodded once, absorbing it. David looked as though he wanted to object, defend, explain, redirect. But even he seemed to understand that the room would not support him anymore. Not after Henry's tears, not after the plainness of what had been said out loud. Caroline tried again. Would you be willing to give us a minute? Elijah looked at Henry. Do you want me to wait in the study? Henry nodded frantically. So Elijah stepped into the next room and closed the glass door most of the way. He did not leave. Through the softened sounds, he could hear raised voices, then lower ones, then long silence. At one point, Henry cried again. At another, Caroline did. David's voice remained mostly quiet, which somehow made it harder to interpret. Elijah stood by a bookshelf full of unread hardcovers and looked out at the rain in the backyard, thinking about how many black professionals spend half their careers doing excellent work for people who do not trust them until a child, a crisis, or a public embarrassment forces the truth into the center of the room. 15 minutes later, Caroline opened the door. Her face was blotched around the eyes. David stood behind her, rigid and chastened in a way that suggested he was still fighting himself and losing. Henry sat at the table clutching a tissue. Caroline said, "If you are willing, we would like to apologize." Elijah waited. David spoke first, probably because it cost him more. "What happened was inappropriate. We should not have done that in front of Henry, and—" He stopped, started again. "Some of our concerns were not as objective as we told ourselves they were." That was not eloquent. It was, however, closer to honesty than Elijah had expected. Caroline added, "We have underestimated both your work and its effect on our son. And I think," she swallowed, "I think we have also asked him to carry too much of our fear in the name of excellence." Henry stared at the table while she said it. Elijah stood very still for a moment. He knew the question hanging underneath the apology. Would he stay? Should he? Was it self-respect to walk out, or mercy to remain for Henry's sake? There was no clean answer. Life rarely offers one to people doing emotional labor in racialized rooms. So he asked the only question that mattered. "If I continue," he said, "does anything actually change for him?" Caroline looked at Henry, then back at Elijah. "It has to." David nodded once, slower. "Yes." Elijah did not trust promises easily, but he trusted what he had heard from Henry. He trusted that child's panic, his relief, his accuracy. "Then we start with this," he said. "No more discussing his performance like he's not in the room. No more comparing him to other children, and no more undermining the lesson in real time. If you disagree with my methods, you ask later." Both parents agreed too quickly, the way people do when shame has not yet settled into practice. Elijah looked at Henry. "Do you still want to finish the problem set?" Henry gave a watery laugh and nodded. "Yeah." So they sat back down. Not as if nothing had happened, as if something had. The rest of the lesson was messy, quiet, and real. Henry got 2 problems wrong from nerves and fixed them on the second pass. Caroline stood in the kitchen doorway once and seemed to think better of entering. David disappeared entirely. When Elijah finally packed up to leave, Henry walked him to the front door and hugged him without asking first, then immediately looked embarrassed. Elijah hugged him back anyway. In the weeks that followed, the house changed unevenly, like most houses do when truth enters through a child instead of an adult. Caroline tried hardest, sometimes too visibly, with the awkward overcorrection of someone newly aware of themselves. But she listened more. She stopped narrating Henry's grades at dinner. She even apologized to him privately one night, an event so rare he mentioned it in disbelief during a session 2 days later. David took longer. Pride often does. Yet even he stopped interrupting lessons. Once, passing the dining room, he heard Henry explain a multi-step problem with new confidence and said only, "Good work." It sounded stiff, but it was the first uncomplicated praise his son had heard from him in months. By spring, Henry's math grade had risen to an A-. More importantly, he no longer flinched when he saw numbers on a page. At the end of the semester, St. Bartholomew invited parents and tutors to an academic showcase. Caroline asked Elijah if he would attend as Henry's guest. He hesitated, then agreed. At one point, David introduced Elijah to another parent as the tutor who changed everything for Henry. It was not a perfect sentence, too tidy, too late, but it was public, and in rooms like that, public matters. Later, as the event ended, Henry pulled Elijah aside and said, "You know what the worst part was?" Elijah smiled a little. "There are a lot of candidates." Henry looked down, then up again. "I thought if they fired you, it meant they were right about me." That landed deeper than anything his parents had said. Elijah rested a hand briefly on the boy's shoulder. "No," he said, "it would have meant they were wrong about a lot of things." including that. Henry nodded, eyes bright but dry this time. Sometimes the loudest truth in a house does not come from the people who own it. Sometimes it comes from the child sitting at the table, crying hard enough to shatter everybody's performance at once. Rich parents tried to fire the black tutor mid-lesson because they thought the moment would prove who had authority. In the end, it proved something else entirely. It proved that their son knew exactly who had helped him, exactly who had hurt him, and exactly what kind of person had made room for him to believe he was not broken. And once he said it in tears, no one in that house could honestly pretend not to hear it anymore.